Welcome back to Ready for Merge, the podcast about the evolution of Bitcoin and Ethereum. I'm your host, Christine D. Kim, and today's show is another bi-weekly brief updating you on the latest developments in Bitcoin and Ethereum. Normally, I structure this show into two segments, the Bitcoin updates and then the Ethereum updates, or vice versa. But today I'm going to be experimenting with a whole new show format for these biweekly briefs. Instead of flipping it between Bitcoin and Ethereum, I'm going to structure this brief into technical and non-technical updates, giving you guys the high-level updates on what's going on with Bitcoin and Ethereum development first, and then getting into the nitty-gritty details with a bit more technical jargon that I use in the latter half of the episode. Before we get started with today's show, a few announcements. First, special thanks to Blockspace Media for sponsoring another Ready for Merge episode, today's biweekly brief. Blockspace will be hosting a Bitcoin developer conference in New York City next Thursday, April 16th. To learn more about that conference and get tickets, head over to opnext.dev. That's opnext.dev, D-E-V. Second, if you're interested in sponsoring an upcoming Ready for Merge episode and speaking directly to an audience of protocol developers and enthusiasts, please reach out to me via the contact form on my advisory website, protocolwatch.com. That's protocolwatch.com. Now, onwards with today's show. Starting with the non-technical updates, this is the part of the episode where I will give a brief overview of the various upgrades that are being planned for Bitcoin and Ethereum. I'll share a little bit about their status and the high-level motivations for these upgrades. I won't get into the nitty-gritty technical details of every single code change that will be included in these upgrades, but I will hopefully be able to package what's going on in Bitcoin and Ethereum development in a bit more accessible way. And to that, for the rest of this episode too, I've decided that I'm going to use the screen share feature of the tool that I use, which is Riverside, to record these podcasts, in the hopes that for people that are watching on video, you can see and follow along with some of the material that I'm sharing. Getting started on the Bitcoin side, for the next major kind of upgrade that users can anticipate for Bitcoin, it's Bitcoin Core v31. So this is just a new version of the Bitcoin Core software, which is the software that the majority of people run on their computers to connect to the Bitcoin blockchain themselves directly. And the prior version of the software, Bitcoin Core v30, was released back in October. Bitcoin Core developers try and do a new release every roughly 6 months. So they're due for another one, and they are on track. I haven't heard of any major delays for the upcoming release, v31. The last I checked, there is pretty healthy indication of the release being more or less ready to go. There's a milestone progress on GitHub that tracks basically the open issues or the remaining kind of code changes or concerns that need to be addressed regarding this release before it can be finalized. And as you can tell, the vast majority of what needs to be addressed has already been addressed. In a prior newsletter of mine, BTC Before Light, I did summarize the major features that are going into Bitcoin Core v31. However, at a high level, all you have to really know is that the next version of Bitcoin Core is going to provide marginal improvements to the efficiency of Bitcoin Core nodes and their privacy as well. There are no consensus-breaking features in v31, which means that all of the features are entirely optional for node operators to adopt. None of the features are particularly controversial either, which is a bit of a change from the prior release, v30, which if you want to learn more about the controversy that had happened for the prior release, you can refer back to the very first episode that I ever recorded for the Ready for Merge podcast. One other kind of update or status update about the status of v31 for Bitcoin. There's a second release candidate out for v31. So these are like near finalized versions of v31 that is opened up for public testing by a wider group of Bitcoin developers. Anybody can download this software. It's all neatly packaged as if it were an official Bitcoin Core release, and all Bitcoin node operators and developers are encouraged to try running it, see if there's any issues, and report back to Bitcoin Core developers. So they've already run through one release candidate of V31, as you can see from this tweet by Michael Ford, who's a Bitcoin Core maintainer, one of the most active Bitcoin Core developers out there. He's sharing that a second release candidate is now available for people to start running and testing. And this was on April 3rd. So I imagine now that they've gotten all the feedback they need, and everyone should anticipate and expect a new official finalized Bitcoin Core release out shortly. On the Ethereum side, let's see what the update is for Ethereum upgrades, which are, unlike Bitcoin updates and upgrades, far larger in scope and contain code changes that are more controversial generally. This is a site called Forecast. I use it a lot. It's a great website for tracking Ethereum upgrades. And as you can tell, it shows the most recent upgrade that Ethereum developers were able to complete, and that's the Fusaka upgrade that was activated on Ethereum mainnet last December. And it primarily helped Ethereum scale its layer 2 capacity. So the capacity for Ethereum to be able to support third-party protocols that are built on top of Ethereum. You can think of protocols like Arbitrum, Optimism, Base. These are all also called rollups. And Fusaka was very much geared towards helping out the layer 2 protocols and making their operations more scalable, more efficient, cheaper. Now, developers are focused on the Glamsterdam upgrade. This is what they are working on currently. They are still trying to target it for activation sometime this year, although I maintain that it's far too early to tell when exactly this upgrade could be ready. As I mentioned, I think a couple of episodes ago, or either in a newsletter, for Bitcoin Core releases, they happen on a much more predictable cadence because you're really working on one code base, one client and implementation. Whereas for Ethereum, knowing when Glamsterdam is going to activate on Ethereum, it requires the coordination of 10 plus different code bases and softwares versions that are all maintained and worked on by a variety of different teams, a variety of different developers. So the coordination for these upgrades is significantly harder, and that's why it's not clear at this time, in my opinion, whether or not Glamsterdam will be able to activate this year. Some developers who I've had on this show have said publicly that they don't think it's going to happen this year. Other developers are quite adamant that they can do it. So what's the status right now? Well, we know that Glamsterdam is being tested. The features for Glamsterdam are being tested. If you're curious to know what the features are, I have a little Google spreadsheet that tracks all of the EIPs that developers want to include into this upgrade. And as you can tell, there are a lot of features, a lot of different proposals. At a high level, the main thrust of this upgrade, the Glamsterdam upgrade, is to scale Ethereum. Make Ethereum layer 1, not just for layer 2 protocols, but even users that are directly transacting on Ethereum, to make Ethereum more efficient, cheaper to use, and be able to process transactions faster. So that is really the thrust of block level access lists, which is a headliner feature. It's a headliner just means that it's one of the main features that developers are prioritizing for this upgrade. This is about parallelizing transaction execution. We've got EPBS, enshrined proposer builder separation, on the consensus layer side of the Ethereum Glamsterdam upgrade. Also a headliner feature, also is intended and geared towards helping making Ethereum more scalable. As you can tell, there's still quite a few proposals that developers have not started to test yet. Considered for inclusion simply indicates that these proposals are proposals that developers want to include in Glamsterdam but haven't yet started to implement. Developers are primarily still focused on just getting the headliner features out the door and shipped. And one of the ways in which developers are actively testing and preparing features for Glamsterdam they've got these things called DevNets, which are basically private developer-focused test nets, where they try and see if all clients, the 10 plus clients that I mentioned in code bases, can all work smoothly with one another and are able to achieve interoperability with one another. On the execution layer side of the proposal, developers are already on their fourth DevNet. They start counting these from zero, which I'm sure is maybe like a developer thing, but they are targeting another DevNet launch later this week. By the time you are listening to this episode, maybe the Ball DevNet 3 will have already launched. And later on in this month, they are planning a DevNet where they can combine the consensus layer proposals and implementations that they have with the execution layer EIPs and just have one large DevNet to see if all the proposals and all the client implementations are working smoothly. With every single DevNet launch, there's new issues, new bugs, and kinks that are found, which just goes to show that developers are still hard at work getting this upgrade prepared for mainnet, and they've still got their work cut out for themselves to really get Glamsterdam in a state where testing for this upgrade can be opened up even more, and still quite a ways to go before having really a concrete date and timeline around its implementation and activation on mainnet. So that's the status on Glamsterdam. Coming back to that Forecast website, there is another upgrade that developers are planning in parallel, and it's an upgrade that's going to happen after the Glamsterdam upgrade. It's called Hegota. And for the Hegota upgrade, developers are still in the midst of scoping it out, i.e. deciding which features should be prioritized for this upgrade. There's quite a bit of controversy around EIP 8141 that continues on. Another alternative name for the proposal is called frame transactions. You might have heard of it if you've been lurking around on crypto Twitter. On the Ethereum side, at a high level, frame transactions are a UX improvement for Ethereum. It's designed to make transaction validation, the way that users authorize transactions from their accounts, far more flexible. For now, they've given it a CFI status, a considered for inclusion status, which I reported on a couple weeks ago in my ACD After Hours newsletter. However, it's unclear exactly what this will mean for the rest of the Hegota planning process. The complexity of frame transactions is quite large, and there's still quite a bit of that proposal that is still to be worked out and is underspecified, and still quite a bit of disagreement around how exactly frame transactions should be implemented. So developers are in this kind of awkward place where they want to continue working on frame transactions, but they're not quite certain if that should be the most important prioritized feature for Hegota. So it's unclear if there might be room for other major features that are prioritized ahead of frame transactions in Hegota, or if developers just end up scrapping the idea entirely, perhaps pushing it out to a further upgrade in Ethereum's future and focusing their energies for this upgrade on other smaller Ethereum improvement proposals. So yeah, so for now, the understanding of what Hegota will shape up to be is still quite unclear. So that was your high level, kind of non-technical way, I hope, that made things a bit more accessible to know what's going on regarding the upgrades that are being planned for Bitcoin and Ethereum so far. Now let's move on to the technical part of this biweekly brief, which I've unofficially dubbed the If You Know, You Know section. And this is the section where I'm going to get a bit more technical and use more advanced terminology that some of my newer listeners, people that are not crypto native, may not be very familiar with. If you are new, please, stick with me. Don't get alarmed. You can check out the show notes of today's episode for more resources explaining some of these terms and topics. And you can also ask away in the comments, and I'll be sure to get back to you. And slowly but surely, you will get a hang of the lingo, get a hang of the terminology. But I'm hoping that these updates and the technical updates section will be a lot more substantive updates for those of you that are listening to this show and already keep up to date with my newsletters and already know are in the know about crypto or working in this industry full time. So let's get right into it. The main topic that I want to talk about is the Google quantum paper. This is the talk of the town in the crypto industry right now. And it's a paper that was released earlier this month by Google Quantum AI, Berkeley, Stanford, and the Ethereum Foundation. And it basically offers findings that show that digital signatures, cryptography that is used to secure user funds on Ethereum and Bitcoin and a bunch of other blockchains is actually potentially easier to break than most people thought. One article on the Google quantum paper that I found was actually quite helpful is a article by NVK. One of the main findings of this paper is that basically the results show a 20x improvement over what was initially thought to be the required threshold for how much infrastructure, much computing power would be needed to break Bitcoin's elliptic curve cryptography, and which is the same cryptography that many other public blockchains use. This article by NVT also highlights one common misconception about the actual threat to Bitcoin and to other blockchains as not really being a threat to mining or the way that blocks are produced, but really a threat to the way that you would authenticate and authorize transactions. So Bitcoin has digital signatures, as NVT explains, that are generated from the elliptic curve cryptography. And the mathematical problem that is used by this cryptography could potentially, a quantum computer could potentially be able to solve these mathematical equations at such a speed and such an efficiency that they would be able to derive users' private keys from the public key addresses that are being used to sign off on transactions. So every time a Bitcoin user is authorizing a transaction on Bitcoin, they authorize it with their private key that is not published on chain, but instead they do share their public key address. And with quantum computing, the concern is that quantum computers will be able to solve the mathematical equations needed to derive the private key from your public key, and that malicious actors could then use your private key to sign off on transactions that you didn't authorize. That really is the crux of what Bitcoiners are worried about with a quantum computer, and as is Ethereum developers as well. One other Bitcoiner, and this article, there's one more article that I want to highlight around the conversation around the threat of quantum computing on Bitcoin. And this one's by Udi Wertheimer. He's a longtime Bitcoiner and very infamous, I would say, crypto troll on X. But he has this article that kind of highlights that the infrastructure beyond just signing off on your transactions is something that most Bitcoiners are not taking into serious consideration. So there are layer 2 protocols like Lightning and wallets that will publish your public key. So even if you were to migrate to your funds to a quantum secure address, then your layer 1 account is fine. But all of the accounts that you might be managing through a wallet provider, through Lightning, these are all still relying on ECDSA, on elliptic curve cryptography. And your public keys would be exposed, which means that in the event of a quantum attack, then, those public keys could be used to, again, derive the private keys and then sign off on all these unauthorized transactions. So Udi was really saying in this article that it's important to understand that the infrastructure that is supporting Bitcoin payments, that is supporting Bitcoin custody, these are all infrastructures that would have to update in order to really secure users against quantum attacks. So this is obviously provoking quite a bit of concern and fear that Bitcoin won't be ready in time to address the quantum threat. And even if Bitcoin is ready, that maybe the overarching infrastructure of Bitcoin payment solutions and wallet infrastructure will not have migrated to secure solutions. And Nick Carter, who also a longtime Bitcoiner, He has for a while now been just pounding at this drum of quantum computing being a very serious threat that Bitcoin developers need to act more seriously on. Um, Shared this tweet about Bitcoin getting a roadmap in place for becoming quantum secure and transitioning over to quantum secure cryptography. Google, Cloudflare, and a bunch of other major companies have already shared that before 2030, they're going to have quantum secure operations and alternatives. For Bitcoin, what is the roadmap? What are Bitcoiners going to do? There's so much at stake. To many of these concerns, Bitcoin developers have been highlighting various Bitcoin proposals like BIP 360, as well as other conversations in the Bitcoin development mailing list and delving Bitcoin threads that do evidence that Bitcoin developers are thinking about this. They're trying to figure out what the first step towards making Bitcoin quantum resistant should be and what the best way to start making that transition should be. But it is true that there is no particular defined roadmap that Bitcoiners have right now to concretely say that they'll be ready for a post-quantum future by 2030. If anything, Bitcoin developers are also focused on a bunch of other initiatives, be it, securing Bitcoin against age-old security threats that have nothing to do with post-quantum computers, but just have more to do with edge cases that were never quite addressed from Bitcoin's genesis back in 2009. I'm talking about the Great Consensus Cleanup. So yes, the quantum paper has caused alarm, and it is directing more focus and attention to initiatives like BIP 360, but there is by no means, I would say, a concrete roadmap just yet for Bitcoin development. On the Ethereum side, it's funny because with Ethereum Foundation and its researchers being named in the Google paper, I think it's really maybe characterized Ethereum as being more quantum prepared than other blockchains. Indeed, the Ethereum Foundation researcher Justin Drake recently said in an interview, quote, "I've stopped thinking about post-quantum as a hurdle that we have to overcome, and I think of it more as an opportunity for Ethereum to stand out as the very first global financial system that is post-quantum secure, not just relative to its competitors, but also relative to fiat and TradFi," end quote. Quite the take. So the thing about Ethereum's preparations for post-quantum security is that Ethereum developers are not just focused on securing Ethereum for the post-quantum future. Ethereum developers are essentially thinking about the post-quantum future in a much broader lens and thinking about it, as Justin Drake says in this interview, as an opportunity to simplify the Ethereum code base in radical ways, to make Ethereum, introduce pretty radical upgrades to Ethereum that will make it even more scalable than current estimations and upgrades like Glamsterdam and Hegota will be able to make it. And so, as I mentioned in a prior newsletter that I wrote for ACD After Hours, Ethereum has a very ambitious post-quantum development roadmap. It's pursuing many different objectives at the same time as post-quantum security, which ultimately may make it harder for Ethereum to just get the job done of preparing for a post-quantum future. On the Bitcoin side, there is no consensus yet on what the post-quantum roadmap could look like. However, everyone is more or less aligned that the changes will be as minimal as possible. That is something that everybody wants. Whereas on the Ethereum side, the opposite is true. The post-quantum roadmap is the sky's the limit for what could be included in that bundle of code changes. But for Bitcoin, the culture of its development is to change as little about the protocol as possible. And thus, it's not immediately clear, I'd say, which protocol is going to be faster to adopt a post-quantum secure signature alternative. Both are making progress towards it, but both are challenged finding challenges in the decentralized decision making process, which is illustrated by the struggles when it comes to scoping out the Hegota upgrade on the Ethereum side and for Bitcoin. And being able to coalesce around a strategy for a soft fork proposal. These are all hurdles that need to be overcome, that need to be met in order for any changes to happen on the consensus layer for either of these protocols. So that's really what's going to determine the post quantum readiness for either protocol. It's going to be what actually gets into an upgrade. And so, no matter how much talk or how much fighting there is that you see on CryptoX, it really doesn't mean or amount to much unless you see those words being backed up by real decision making on the protocol development side, which again, for Ethereum Bitcoin, you haven't seen quite a lot of translation happening as of yet around a post quantum roadmap being talked about, translating into actual decisions on the development side, either in the Bitcoin developers meetings that happen on Thursdays or the all core developers meetings happening on Ethereum also on Thursdays. So that concludes my takeaways on the Google quantum paper and the latest on the quantum readiness of Bitcoin and Ethereum. Thank you for joining me for another episode of Ready for Merge. Let me know what you thought of today's show format. Some of my listeners may notice that this is loosely inspired by the format of NLW's AI Daily Brief. The AI Daily Brief is a show that was recommended to me by my friend Chris, and it is an excellent show that updates listeners on AI-related developments that I felt inspired to try switching things up with my updates and developments for Bitcoin and Ethereum. Please join me again next week for a new episode of Ready for Merge. Next week's episode is going to be a guest episode. I'll give you guys updates via Twitter and other show channels about who I'll be interviewing and on what topics, so stay tuned for that. This was your Ready for Merge biweekly brief, helping you stay ahead of the curve on Bitcoin and Ethereum development. Thanks for listening. Until next time, bye everyone.